good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. We'll be talking about the 100 ways to blow a budget, or rather 100 ways to avoid blowing the budget. Today we have Fredrik Johansson, partner and executive director at Tilburg Design of Sweden, and Nick Farrell, who's the co-owner of Trimline. My name is Andrew Brown, I'm director at SMC. We're delighted to be here on home soil today, so welcome all to London. Beautiful winter's day here. We're going to be phrasing the topics today to three key pillars. Three key pillars of any project. You've got your pre-contract phase, your post-contract phase, and then you've got your delivery. And we'll be identifying a lot of the challenges and the risks involved with those processes, which may incur additional cost, where do they originate from, and how best to avoid them. So the first part is obviously the pre-contract phase. So the first one, Fredrik, I'd like to ask you, what would you say are the key inputs from an owner, and what processes do you advise they put in place to avoid additional cost in the pre-contract phase?
Oh, well, that's a big question. I can think of three main things. Say to have the right team in order, both on the owner's side or the buyer's side, and the builder and all your other consultants, to have the right players and the right decision makers in the room early enough. Second thing is possibly let's say to have your contractual documents in order, and knowing the hierarchy between the different parts of the documents package. Yeah. And then the third part is really having a good process, clearly defined decision process and doing things in the right order. So moving from the bigger things down to the smaller things and so forth.
When you say the smaller things, it's incredible the detail that you'll find in a contract specification that if it's missed could incur the cost. I mean, we had one particular project where the owner was in a hurry to capture a slot with a builder, and they rushed through the process, and they hadn't brought on board any of the outfitters, the builders at that point, and they hadn't brought on board the architect. And one thing that was critical for them was to have a cigar lounge. And just by not having that word, they missed adding that one word to their GA, to their contract specification. And by adding it after the contract, right there was six-figure sum. So it sounds like a small detail, but when you look at the small details, they can actually add up to be quite substantial costs from a lot of the builders, because obviously there's HVAC involved, steel elements involved. And I think by investing early on in the pre-contract phase, we are then able to find all of these small details that are missing to remove the risk of cost later on. Now, Nick, from your side, from a refurbishment point of view, when you look to actually see the pre-contract process in place, what can the owner be doing with the outfitters to help reduce the risk of cost?
So I think the main thing is getting us involved as early as possible. I think that the whole project hinges on time, and the more time everyone has to work on it, the better the outcome will be. And so getting us involved as early as possible gives us the ability to help and advise in terms of supply chain. It gives us the ability to talk to our supply chain early and kind of pre-warn them, I guess, that things are coming, find out where problems might be in terms of lead times. If there are those issues, we can then address it. We can find an alternative that matches the design intent, or and obviously has all the certifications that are needed. And I think the other thing as well is it allows us to look at what's planning to happen and kind of advise where there might be a little bit more cost spent, but actually a big benefit. So rather than on a refit just repairing something, actually, if you look at over the next 5 or 10 years, it might be better to replace it because in the case of ADA, for example, you might then be able to put a lot of stuff there where you might need to do that in a few years anyway. And so I think you can get the benefits of that. And if we get involved early, we can help with that process and help advise. So we get the best outcome for everyone.
I think we were talking earlier on about how collaborating earlier on with the architect, with the owners as well, is going to be key to making sure that we get everything defined pre-contract, so there aren't any things added later on saying, actually, we'd like to have this. If we work together early on, we can capture all of those things.
Yeah.
But that again comes back to our collaboration. And I think another thing from the outfitter's perspective is, for design, one of the most important things for us are the brand standards, and defining those brand standards in the contract specification, because some standards don't actually cost more. Aesthetically, they're better, but they don't cost more. But there'll be certain things that the owner will want to have, which are perhaps not typical for their brand perhaps, but it may not correlate with the budget that they've assigned or the reference-ship that they have. So again, we can work collectively as a group to identify all of the brand standards and tie that into the overall specification.
Yeah, completely. I think that understanding the sort of red lines of what we can have an input on and what we can't, and knowing, which helps later down the line, if there does become an issue with a material or a finish, it means that we know where we stand and we can help more effectively. So as long as it's clear, it comes back to the clear spec, I think, and as defined as possible, so that it gives everyone the best chance.
So I think generally the consensus is that perhaps there's too much of a rush applied to the pre-contract phase. Just that small investment of time and expense at the beginning will save millions in the end of the project. And again, it sounds like such a simple thing. I mean, to validate the sizes of venues, to make sure that you're not overspending in an area, evaluating whether that bar actually needs a refit or can you actually replace it, which is the cheaper alternative. It takes time to do these things, but it saves a tremendous amount of cost throughout the project. Moving on to the post-contract phase. First question will go again to Nick. So there are challenges now more than ever in the supply chain. What can be done to mitigate the risks during the design?
Yeah, so definitely challenges in the supply chain at the moment. Some materials which used to take 3 weeks, 4 weeks to arrive, now 8, 9, 10, who knows? Quite often we're being given a lead time, and that turns out to be wrong or change. And part of the problem is the time between us quoting something and then giving the go-ahead to something. Everything's changed, and so that makes it very difficult. I think, again, it comes back to being involved early, because if we forewarn suppliers that things are likely, then they're prepped, and they're ready to go in certain circumstances, and those lead times are more accurate or thought about. I think it gives us more time for logistics, because logistics can be a huge increase in cost. The part of the title is sort of flying in the galley. As soon as you start flying heavy things around, the costs go through the roof. And so we want to try and avoid that at all costs, and pre-plan all of that big stuff to come in early. So I think that's really important. And certainly at the moment, the more time we have, the better. We know there are challenges. We know that the cruise companies have issues. They're getting sort of budgets later than they used to. There's internal things that go on, so we can't necessarily have all the time we'd like. But the more time we have, the better, because it helps bring the cost down.
I mean, we're finding some projects where we've done the design in 2019, but the build's not until 2024. So we've got 5 years that material needs to be in production, and then we're finding later on we're having to re-specify like for like, but it's another process. And when you talk about logistics, with artwork, as an example, we use a lot of international artists on our projects, and we want all of the art to be delivered to the shipyard or to the refurbishment location, wherever it might be, using the most cost-effective logistics. And it means we have to pre-plan all of this very early on, because, like you said, the moment you start air freighting, the costs are going to go up tremendously.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's crazy. And also, I think it depends how you organise the logistics as well. So some companies will want to have it all shipped and combined in one location. It will get repacked and then it will be shipped somewhere else. But that might add 3, 4, 5 weeks to the overall shipping time. So again, it's looking at all of those bits and trying to make it as efficient as possible, especially right now where timescales are so tight, and it's the difference between a job happening and not happening, or a job having to happen in 2 phases rather than getting everything done at once. Certainly the refit side of things.
Fred, when we've talked about reference ships, or even on certain limited projects where they don't even have a reference ship, where do you most often see owners falling astray?
Okay, so first thing is obviously to choose the right reference ship. That's pretty obvious. And then making sure that everybody's aligned how to use the reference ship. So is it used just for the look and feel of things, which is quite often the interpretation, but we prefer it to be more of the complexity and the quality and the standards of things. And then also the how deep into the reference ship you go. If you have a specification, or if you have a reference ship that looks wonderful, but everything behind the surface is perhaps sort of second class, then you may be in trouble, because if you in your, I don't know, your catering equipment, for instance, you have a beautiful outside of the waiter station, and then on the inside you may just have a laminated drawers, for instance, and you want stainless steel drawers on the inside, and you have to pay extra for that. So that's another example of a good way to waste money, is to not ensure that you know enough about the reference ship. And then again, the relationship between the reference ship, the contract spec, your design intent, any other appendixes you might have. If you don't know the hierarchy between the three, then you will find yourself, the builder, playing the 3-cup game, with you. Oh, sorry, this relates to the reference ship. No, today it's the specification, chapter 4. No, so chapter 1, and so forth. And you can never win that game. So you have to be really, really careful with how you use the reference ship, and also the hierarchy between the contractual documents.
You mentioned about the reference ship. I think it's also important that when we talk about reference ships, it's not the first in series. Usually the owner will always improve, adapt the specification from ship to ship. So we want to make sure we're using the final and best version of that series. So I think that's obviously a big help as well.
And that it's as, well, you have to know if it's as ordered or as built, or as delivered, even including all the extras and owner supply stuff and what's artwork and not. And there's a million traps you can fall into there just on that. So.
I think it's also important that your reference ship, at least in the contract specification, we're able to define perhaps some of the facilities and area types that the reference ship didn't have. An owner may want to have a casino. The reference ship doesn't have a casino. We have to make sure that it's specified appropriately within the contract specification. Now, I suppose that one of the biggest elements within any project is the approvals process. Now, in terms of the approvals process, what is the ideal scenario from an owner side that you look for? And again, where do you see the pitfalls from an owner where perhaps they don't have the setup a way that supports a project?
I think in terms of approvals, for us, it's really important. Sounds obvious, but it's really important to have a very clear understanding of who is in charge of approving that particular thing. And even if they say they're in charge, are they really in charge, or is there someone hidden behind the scenes who actually might second guess that decision later? So I think that's important. I think understanding that early on, because we're going to prioritise all of the long lead time items and a lot of the FF&E type items and finishes, and we want to get that signed off so that we can place orders, so that we can mitigate those logistics costs later, so we can avoid flying things in, and knowing for certain something's been signed off is final. That's done is important. What we don't want to do is have something signed off one week, start the whole chain going, and a lot of things happen after that point, and then find out a week later actually they've changed their mind, because that's a prime way to increase cost, obviously. So yeah, a very clear approvals, a small team ideally, so there's not a huge committee in charge of deciding these things. All of that helps.
Yeah, I totally agree. And we found that the more people that, over time the team grows, and the project calls for more and more people, and you have more and more people coming into the project where their personal preferences, their experiences, or their personal tastes, and then you can get a very blurred picture of what the original intent was in the end. And we've designed, we put together this graph the other day with let's say you have the horizontal line is the timeline, and the vertical line is the cost, or it could be stress level, or it could be frustration as well. And the longer into the process you go, the more expensive it gets exponentially, and your freedom of choice goes the other way around. And so what we quite often do nowadays is that we try to establish a kind of manifesto from the very beginning. So preferably a brand manifesto, but at least a design manifesto, so that the whole organization is aligned on the vision and the goal, the priorities. And then you can at least reduce the risks of late changes and contradictions within the organization or what have you.
Like reduce the risk.
Yes.
Not remove the risk, but reduce the risk.
Not eliminate, but reduce it. Yeah.
I think that the kind of instances we've seen mainly comes from the changes, and it depends on the appetite of the owner, because we've got some owners who are very regimental in their approach to a project. We've had an instance where they've been very regimental and they've thought about changing an area and moving it elsewhere. Then they got scared and put it back because they know that there are going to be costs. And if they're going to build a project for a value, they want to maintain that value because they have a very strong commercial awareness. But that's perhaps because that company didn't have an owner who has, like you say, personal tastes and preferences. And there are other two instances where change comes about. Sometimes a new personnel comes into a project and they want to put their stamp on that project, and then they'll bring in changes perhaps when it doesn't fit within the schedule. And then sometimes we get owners who see something out in the industry that's just been released or out in the land-based market and they want to bring that on board. And again, these are all fantastic opportunities to have this on your project, but there is always going to be that associated cost. And it goes beyond outfitting and design. There's going to be schedule influences, which again is going to affect your logistics. So those are the things where we have the most risk. It's when we have changes that are not according to the schedule. And it can be small changes, large changes, and it's about providing the owner the insight before they make that decision to guide them and nurture them and say, okay, well, we can move the money from this part into this part. There's going to be some cost still, or most owners don't want to reduce the standard of somewhere else to provide the money for this. We have to explain to them cause and effect. A lot of them are very open to this, and it's us guiding the owner through that process which allows us to support them and perhaps find other solutions along the way.
Sure.
Now, coming on to one of the critical parts of a project, which is the delivery. We've spoken about logistics and the impacts of delivery and how that can incur additional costs. What other elements of the delivery process do you see the most risk for generating cost?
So I think from our point of view, we are a project management company at heart. That's what we do. And so the project management on site is critical. We need to understand where we are at any point in that process from as soon as we get on board all the way through the process. And the reason we need to know that is we need to know if we're ahead, behind, when materials need to come in for certain parts of it, so that we can kind of preempt that and make it as efficient as possible. But it's really important for us, things go wrong on site, it's really important for us to spot problems early so that we have time to fix it. There's no point going through a 4-week refit and saying at the end of 3 weeks, actually, we haven't got time to finish. That's not what we want to do. We want to be able to spot that a couple of days in so that we've got time to get more resource in or reallocate resource or deal with it in the right way. Now, our job is obviously to plan it right in the first place so that that doesn't happen. But things go wrong. Materials are potentially late and you have to be able to deal with it. So what we've spent a lot of time doing is trying to make that into a process where we've got real-time information on where we currently are. So it's not a guessing game at the end of each day that the project manager puts together a report that says we're 19% through. Actually, if our thing says we're 19% through, that's where we are. And so we've spent a lot of time refining that so that it's not a judgment call, it's a fact. That's how far through the process we are. So I think that's important. If you don't get that right, then you do end up 3 weeks out of a 4-week project and you find you've got to fly people in at the last minute who are charging more for the privilege, or you haven't got the material there that you need to and you have to fly that in as well. So yeah, it all comes down to flying. Fundamentally, that's the huge cost, but running out of time is the enemy, effectively.
I think one part there again, one thing we're seeing over and over again is the close collaboration between all parties, making sure that if you need to find a solution, you're working with the designers who can help provide you that solution. So again, it's all about that partnership, that teamwork to find those solutions.
And it comes, you know, you mentioned about the manifesto and having kind of very clear lines in the spec as to what can be touched, what can't be touched. And our job is to deliver the design intent, you know, take that render that was done right at the start that the board, you know, approved, and make the real thing look like that. That's what our job is. And if we know ahead of time that we have flexibility on this product or that product and something goes wrong with that, we're able to take steps to find a different product that matches, and we know that we've got authority to do that within certain bounds. So having that manifesto and having that clear spec, I think, is really important because it gives us autonomy to fix problems early and know where we are with things.
Yeah, I think just like in the pre-contract stage, I love the British expression "penny-wise, pound-foolish," where you may save a little bit on the follow-up process by not having this, you know, site office that can take care of the workshop drawing approvals or the quality control, the inspections, and the surveys on board and supervising. And you save a little bit there, but then you have a ship that is maybe, you know, harder to maintain and it's going to require more and more repairs and it's not lasting as long and it's more just maintenance intense, so you need more crew on board, and you know that you could easily 100-fold your cost after that by having a sub-optimized ship, sub-optimized product that you have to live with for 20 years.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's looking at the cost of ownership over, you know, 5, 10, 20 years rather than just that one immediate thing. And you know, installing a stage floor, for example, if you do it right and you put multiple layers before the stage floor, it's a lot easier to change in 5 years' time when inevitably you need to change that top layer. You don't have to take all the base up and do it all again. You save on labour, you save on materials, and it's, you know, over the long term, that makes perfect sense. The cheap way and the quick way to do it is the other way, but you end up spending a lot more longer term. So,
I think we've talked obviously about how we can prevent additional costs through the design and through the outfitting, but I also think a big part of it is also in our planning. I mean, we're talking about ways to blow budget, but we also need to make sure we're maximising profit on a project, because if we're planning and designing things ineffectively, we're missing out on opportunities to maximise the profit for the client. That is essentially losing the client money. Again, we talk about collaboration, working with the operators and all of the sub-operators within their infrastructure to make sure we're getting that spar to operate effectively. It's optimized to their requirements. We're not being wasteful. The restaurants, we're not oversizing them. We're not spending too much on outfitting when we actually, this is the ideal size. You know, we're still maintaining that sense of generosity in the space, because generosity leads to the sense of luxury, but we're not overspending, but we're providing an infrastructure for the operator where they're able to service the guest in the most efficient way possible. We're providing those opportunities for those impulse purchases. We're giving them the platform to be able to generate more revenue from a project. And if something's poorly planned, we're going to miss those opportunities. And again, that is just another area where an owner is going to lose out on profit. Now, we've obviously talked about pre-contract, post-contract delivery. Another important part is obviously how we can then support the client moving forward, whether that's with tools or whether that's services. What ways can we support a client after delivery?
So I think, again, one of the things we've been trying to do is make sure that after a project is complete, the client has a complete knowledge of everything that has been done and installed on that ship. And that's when we take on a refit project, that's not necessarily the case. We don't know what we're going to find necessarily, but afterwards we want to leave it in a better state. And so what we've been doing is making sure that rather than at the end of a project, we put together this binder with all of the certifications and cleaning instructions for all the materials. Inevitably a binder goes on a shelf somewhere, gets lost, no one can find it again. So what we've done is we've allowed them to log into our system effectively, so they can see for every project all of the materials used, all of the certificates, all of the cleaning instructions, everything else, to give them the best chance of looking after that stuff in the best way, and easy access to it, so they're not wasting time going and finding that later. And I think there's a few things there. I think one, if the ship can look after the things, then it reduces the cost of ownership. So cleaning things in the right way means that they're not going to damage a floor and it has to be replaced, and that's wasteful. Equally, the counter side to that is if we've got time in advance, we can see how they clean things and choose the right materials that fit what the ship does, rather than force them to work the other way. So I think that's quite important. But then, so once they've got those details, it helps them with future refits too. So they can say, right, okay, show me on this particular ship, deck 5, this bar, what finishes did we use 2 years ago? And they're there, they can find them, and then it saves time kind of, using those again later on. So repeat projects, similar to your reference ship, but obviously, down the line with refits where you're taking a scheme and you're taking it onto another ship, you've got easy access to the information. So I think that's important. And I think the other thing, linked to repeating those jobs, if you like, is looking at how that job went, learning from it. So we might spec a certain amount of spare material to take out, contingency if you like, and on the first job we've kind of got a good idea as to what it is, but it might not be perfect. But the next time we've got all of that data from the previous job to say, actually, we took 7% spare material, actually we only need 5, and again, it's a saving. It means the cost comes down for the client. It means from an environmental perspective, we're not wasting as much material. And so I think there's a lot of advantages from learning from that data and that whole circle. So that's really important to us, I think.
We've been thinking about building into the contract that you have maybe 2 or 3 post-delivery, let's say, reconnections with the owner. So you go on board and I knocked my mic out. That you interview the crew on board, maybe, or the operation, the hotel director, whatever, what works and doesn't work on board, and how could we improve the flows, maintenance aspects, obviously build kind of learning curve. As we all know, if you build 3 or 4 ships, usually the 4th ship is perfect, and then you start a new platform again. So if you could speed up that learning curve a bit by being more proactive in the follow-up, the post-delivery service, I think that would help.
I think I like your point. Most of the time you deliver a project, you said, you wave goodbye, but I think the follow-up is such a key thing to.
Thank you.
Key thing to support the owner moving forward, to recognise those key items for the brand.
Yeah, it is, and it takes a lot of time, and there's so many things on board that
We're doing so well.
You have to consider. So it's not an easy process to follow up, but I think it has to be built into the contract actually between the architect and the client in the beginning, that it's part of the whole, let's say, the contract or the deal between buyer and consultant. And it's not just the designer. I guess it could theoretically be everybody who's involved in the project, even the shipyard, learning about how did the engines run and how was the AC after 5 years, whatever.
Imagine as well for Trimline, that would be another important element, to be able to do the follow-up with an owner. Obviously you'll have warranties built in, but to be able to just have a critique to say how things are performing, how materials have lived up.
Yeah, 100%. I think looking at history and learning from it, and actually really using that. I think it's all very well that history kind of being in people's heads and doing a wash up afterwards, but if you can go back after 6 months and after 12 months and learn from that, I think that's really important. And it helps us inform the materials we use next. It helps us feed back to suppliers as well, and build those relationships too, and help with that. And again, we can feed that into our system, so we're not reliant on someone's memory remembering that material failed after 2 years and we shouldn't ever use that again, because that's in Dave's head. We can't leave it in Dave's head. We've got to put it somewhere.
Well, Dave's brilliant.
Dave's brilliant, but memory fallible, and Dave might go under a bus. So we need to make sure that that is in the process, so that when that material goes through again, actually it flags up and says, this didn't last very long, this wasn't very good, so that we can, as long as we're involved early in the process, we can feed that back, and that informs everybody. So, and I think it's part of that virtuous circle, basically, is learning from all of that, and saving cost ultimately, is what it's all about.
There's a tool that I'm particularly enthusiastic about at the moment, and I did an interview with John Ingleton not that long ago, and it was to do with Revit and building information modeling. Mm-hmm. And we're now delivering projects using Revit as a platform, but during the design process, it's a fantastic tool during the design, because we can actually do the complete design, put on some headsets with the owner, and actually walk the ship.
Yeah, that's great.
But that's great for design. But another benefit for it is obviously liaising with the outfitters and bringing in the HVAC models, is upon delivery, we can hand over this model to the owner, and the owner can actually climb into the ship 3 years after delivery, walk to a particular bar, double click on the countertop and say, it's this particular product, it's this reference code, the contact details of this person.
Yeah, this is where we bought it from.
So again, it's again, like you're saying, it's having that handover pack, but this is just an aspect where it's model based. Now, there are positives and minuses with this kind of process. Some owners are not perhaps so tech savvy to be able to navigate these kind of things. Others are very much into this kind of building information modeling process. But as a tool, it's providing this complete package of facilities, which is something I think is a wonderful opportunity for the owner to perhaps capitalize on. And like you say, it's giving them the assets to be able to protect their vessels longer term, and it gives them the insight and access that will allow them to maintain it over a longer period of time.
I think that's great. I think one of the sort of challenges with that is keeping up to date. So after you've done a refit, it needs to be updated with all the changes, the new materials, what's actually happened, and the sort of standard, I guess, of standardizing that process so that everyone contributes in the same way to that model. So that it's otherwise very rapidly it becomes out of date, and then as soon as one bit's out of date, no one trusts the other bit, and it becomes difficult.
Absolutely.
So some way of standardising that and making that systemised, if you like, across lots of different outfitters or builders. That's important to do.
The great thing about having it is that you can incorporate all of the builders' models, and then before actually ripping down that ceiling, we can say, well, let's have a look what's up in there.
What's supposed to be
are
up
we
there?
actually able to pop up in that area? No, HVAC's running through there.
Yeah.
So again, as a tool, perhaps that also allows us to make savings in the fact that we're not going to have to do as much investigation as long as it's up to date.
And that's it, and you've got to trust it. I think it's the surveying. Surveying takes a lot of time, there's a lot of cost involved, and you have to be able to trust what you do. So do you trust the model completely, and who takes responsibility if that's wrong, I guess. We send surveyors out to measure things, obviously, to make sure that we're spot on. If you're relying on a model, is it the operator that owns the model that takes responsibility if that's wrong? I'm not sure. It's a really important thing to get right, I think, and it could potentially save a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of hassle if it can be trusted to be kept current. Yeah.
I guess to really capitalize on that, you would like to have a long-term contract, like a 10-year contract or something. So you build on the know-how and you update and you keep it up to date. So every little new refit or every touch-up that's done on board is documented in that model, I guess.
Absolutely, yeah, and that would be our intent would be to do that, and have these long-term relationships with clients where you can do that, because it makes everyone's life so much easier. Absolutely.
So I think some of the key takeaways from the conversation has been having a robust contract specification, GA, and early collaboration. It's one of the key parts. having a well-structured and organized and clear, distinct approvals process, perhaps advising owners where the most risk will be from making changes and how we can perhaps support them in minimizing the cost of those changes. Again, delivery, making sure that we're forward planning, being able to plan for the most effective and low-cost solutions for logistics and installation. And again, supporting the owner after the ship's delivered with all of these different tools and services to make sure that if they go for any further refurbishments down the line, that they've got all the information and support that they need. It's at this point where I'm going to throw the microphone out to the crowd to see if we have any questions from what we've discussed today. We've obviously been incredibly thorough.
Paul?
Hello. When the ship is built, for the spaces, you do fire load calculations, looking at the combustibility and such of whatever is going in the spaces. If you've got a refit scenario and the ship's, say, 10 years old, how do you keep control of what's now going into the ship and being taken out of the ship to make sure that the statutory requirements aren't breached?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think so there's two parts to that. I think one is making sure you do a really good survey so that you can try and establish, if we don't have that model up front as to what's exactly on the ship, then we can establish it as closely as possible. And then two, it's down to us to make sure we choose the right materials for the job that have the right certifications, and you know, fundamentally we are planning it right and designing that refit right to meet all the regulatory requirements that should be there. So a lot of that is relying on our databases of materials, so we can find the right materials. If they're not available, finding an alternative that matches those requirements and has got all the certifications in place. And also potentially looking at the type of vessel. So if we're doing a ferry, for example, in Europe, we might have different regulatory requirements to a cruise ship in America. So we might have to look at, you know, MED and things like that. So very much basing it on our knowledge of materials and a very close survey and good planning ultimately.
I don't have any better answer to that, really. It's, I guess is my mic switched off again? No. I guess we would call Lloyd's Register and Paul, somebody who knows how to drill into it, because we all know if you have a really old ship, it could be layers on layers and layers of material, and you have no idea what's behind the surface and how much combustible stuff there is back there. So we need somebody like you, Paul, to come on board and and drill into it, you know, and make a proper investigation and survey of it. Because otherwise, you know, we can guess, but it's going to be difficult, I think.
I think the challenge is to deconstruct something that already exists without the information up front.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm going to go back to the tools that we have. You talk about having the model where you can go into it. We can also attach certificates into that model. So again, you click on a material, it tells you all about the material, but also certification of that material, IMO spec, everything is contained within that model. But if you don't have that kind of facility, it makes it a lot more difficult to deconstruct.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've got to build it kind of at that point so that you know what then you've got to do with it.
I saw even there's a tool for 3D scanning that you can bring on board. So when you take your panels down, you even scan the piping and everything on the existing ship, and then when you put the panels up again, you have all that background stuff is in your model as well.
It's actually
pretty cool.
That's something that we do at SMC. The equipment itself, we don't own the equipment because it's incredibly complex, but rent the equipment out and that actually plug directly into your Revit model. Mm-hmm. So we can scan a whole place rather than surveying it, and instantly we have a model of the ship, of that space, to be able to work with without having to do any surveying. So it's something that we've learned. I mean, since 2018, it's something we've been learning more about. And it's just these opportunities with technology which will save time and cost. Mm-hmm. It's just, it's improving at such a rapid rate, pace. So it's...
it's quite nice because a lot of those scanners also take color panoramas as well. So as well as just a model, you have a visual representation that you can look at, on multiple heights and things like that. It's really good.
Yeah. It's like a video game when you walk through.
Yeah, it's really good, very useful, and certainly the more expensive ones are getting towards the point where they're accurate enough to do measurements. And again, it comes down to who did that scan and whether you trust it enough for us to take measurements from it to build from, or whether you still want to take a surveyor out to do that.
I think this goes back to the whole point. It's trying to convince owners that this expense at the beginning is going to reap far greater benefits later on in the project. It's convincing them when we talk about pre-contract, about validating volumes and GAs and specifications. It's that investment at the beginning, which we obviously try to promote as much as possible, but some owners aren't willing to have the upfront spend that early on in the project. So I think this is just another example of investing early on to benefit the project later on.
And it is a continuous investment to an extent. Every time there's a refit, you want to update those 3D scans and you want to update those imagery because you've just completely changed the space. And so you need to have a consistent method and model of doing that, definitely. And everyone do it in the same way.
As a tool, we had a client, we were designing a theatre, and they wanted to know how the sightlines compared to one of their existing vessels. And they had scanned the existing vessel, and we sat in the equivalent seat because they were concerned about the balconies. We sat in the equivalent seat on the reference vessel, 3D scanned, and then we sat in our vessel, and we were able to compare like for like the sightlines to the stage. But again, it's just another benefit of having that facility. Any other questions? I think that might be perhaps all of the questions. I have to do a little bit of housekeeping now. So, first of all, there is actually a video screen to the right-hand side, your left, 2 rows across. You have the opportunity to provide your own comments, your own questions, and add them to the discussion today. We also invite you to shop the floor after this conversation. Obviously, there's a lot of stands out there. I myself am going to take some time to have a wander around. I haven't had the opportunity to yet. And there is going to be some speaker interviews afterwards, so there will be a clean down happening within the conference area. So if you wouldn't mind also making room so they can do the handover for the next event. From us, I'd like to say thank you very much for your time today. It's been wonderful to have the conversation with you both.
Thank you.
And again, enjoy London while you're here. It's beautiful weather out there.